but doesn't matter. So our first of 6 Festure speakers is Don Norman. Yeah, where's Don? You're here, okay. Let me give you a little bit of introduction. I first met Don Norman at MIT, came and gave a lecture, guest lecture in one of Marvin's classes. I thought he was great. He's now Professor Emeritus of both Cognitive Science and Psychology at the University of California, San Diego. He was a founding chair of the Department of Cognitive Science and the chair of the Department of Psychology. He's now a professor of computer science, psychology, and cognitive science at Northwestern. And what he's probably most known for is the design of everyday things. If you haven't read that book, you should read it. There's a series of books afterwards, but I think that's the most thought-breaking, trend-breaking book. He also has a reputation as a cantankerous visionary, which I think is like, you know, I'd like to be a cantankerous visionary. I mean, it's like a real good title to have. So, Don?
So it's my job to be cantankerous. And this will be a change in the program from the quasi-seriousness you just saw to rambling, make it up as you go along. Why should I have to write a paper for Danny, I said. He never wrote anything. In fact, it's amazing with somebody who never wrote anything that he has so many publications. And we'll get back to that. Yeah, as you say, he's a good choice of collaborators. So actually, I didn't know Danny for a really long time. At first, I didn't know Danny when I took a course on natural language processing at Harvard. It was Tony Ottinger's course with a whole bunch of guest lecturers. It was about 1965, which is, 43 years ago. Wow, 43 years ago. And sometimes afterwards, when I actually had met Danny, we were reviewing our academic histories, and I mentioned I had taken this course with Tony Ottinger at Harvard, and he said, "Oh, I taught that course." And I said, "No, you didn't." And he said, "Yes, I did." So it turns out I still had my notes. I went back and I looked at my notes just to prove that he wasn't there. And, well, gee, not only was he one of the lecturers, but I had taken notes on everything he said. Oh, well. I continued not to know him after I left Harvard and went to UC San Diego until he showed up in my house one day. And he showed up, this big fellow with lots and lots of people in tow, and he just reminded me just before this talk that he brought basically his lab at BBN to a conference we were holding at UC San Diego. And we couldn't remember, we couldn't decide, the two of us, whether that was when he was in transition from BBN to Xerox or maybe slightly before. So he was coming to UCSD and went back, but the next time I knew him, he was at PARC. I'm not sure what happened either. My memory is simply that whenever I would meet with him from then on, frequently the words BBN and John Seeley Brown and beanbag chairs would show up all the time. And I wasn't sure who he was, but I kept bumping into him, and he was always taking the best beanbag chairs. Alan Kay had hired me, so I was a consultant to what was then called Xerox PARC. But again, the person who was always there and grabbing the best pillows was Danny, so eventually Danny hired me. And so then I moved over to Danny's project to work with Danny, which was actually a lot more fun than trying to work with Alan Kay. It wasn't even possible to see Alan Kay, let alone work with him. There was actually a period of my career where Alan Kay worked for me. What a myth that was. This was when I was at Apple and Alan Kay reported to me. Wow. We had to forbid him from uttering the P word, P being, when I was at PARC, this is how we did things. Anyway, Cambridge, La Jolla, Pajaro Dunes, Monterey, Palo Alto. It seems no matter where I go, there's Danny. For that matter, Tokyo. For that matter, I now live 2 blocks away from him. We just can't avoid each other. And it's kind of neat. After all, among other things, I've got 6 publications out of it, and a lot of walks and a lot of talks. And as you've heard, those are really fun. So even today, he calls me up periodically, once every couple of weeks, saying, hey, how about if I come over for dinner tonight? And my wife, Julie, and I always say, yes. So, who is this guy? Well, from the scientific point of view, as I said, we got 6 publications from 1975 to 1979, so a fairly short period of time when we were working with each other and talking. And the way we worked mainly was that he would come over to my house and we would walk around the cliffs of Del Mar or the streets of La Jolla, or I was on a sabbatical during one of those years at Stanford, and so we would walk around the streets of Menlo Park. And we just would walk and talk. And we were completely disorganized. We would be just triggered by whatever we happened to see in the environment. Like we'd be walking on a street for 6 months, and then one day we'd say, I never saw that store before. And that would start a whole long conversation and trigger. And it was actually a really good era, because it was just the beginning of knowledge representation, information processing in psychology. Psychology was finally waking up and becoming a part of the cognitive revolution. So some small components of psychology and AI were forming together. And it was really quite an exciting era. The papers that we wrote are really just 3 papers. I mean, I'll list them all. One of them is called On Data-Limited and Resource-Limited Processes. Some Principles of Memory Schemata, on the role of active memory processes in perception and cognition, on the analysis of performance operating characteristics, and then descriptions. And then there's another paper which is completely different, which is GUS, which is the dialogue system that you've heard about. And we'll come back to that one. But you have to remember these times. These were the times when we believed in rules, that basically we're going to study and understand cognition because we'll understand the laws of cognition. We'll write them down, and there'll be, declarative laws. And language worked by rules and transformations, and memory, thought, and everything worked by rules, and we could just program it, or write it down somehow or other. And expert systems, actually, we were not part of it. In fact, we were against it. But expert systems came out of the same kind of philosophy. You just figure out the rule, you write this one down, and that one down, and that one down, and you got it. And that was way before that we had discovered statistics and the fact that the brain worked by neurons and neural networks. They hadn't been invented, or if you like, they had been invented, but Minsky and Papert had killed them. Hidden Markov markers, they hadn't yet been invented, and hidden layers in neural networks, they hadn't been invented. And statistical methods in language, well, that was thought to be a cheap trick, and no real researcher would use statistical methods. Those were those days. And what we tried to do was try to understand knowledge representation, because that was really the hot active topic in those days. And there was, my introduction came from the work at BBN, which was Quillian and Collins, both of whom Danny had worked with, and semantic networks. And together with Dave Remmelhard at San Diego, we were starting to work on knowledge representation. And as you heard from Terry, Danny and Terry wrote the KRL, Knowledge Representation Language, a little bit later. But this is all the same tradition, and we worked on schemas and frames and scripts. Those were the names given to this way that we were approaching the problem. And Danny and I were trying to understand what this was all about and how to use it and how to apply it. And I don't think we did anything. In retrospect, it doesn't seem very profound. And what's interesting is at the time, the field seemed to think it was profound. And it's really amusing in retrospect. So if you look at what we did, there were three things. The first was schemas, fleshing them out, understanding their interactions. There was actually a processing thing that came out of this, which is really, I think, the most important result that we talked about that has gotten lost, something we call continually available output. And the notion was that you should have partial output, always output, that a system shouldn't have a problem that it chugs away and then spits out an answer, but that it chugs away and it has an answer. Not a very good answer, a rough approximation. And with time, that approximation gets better and better and better and better. You can see this happening in the way JPEG images show up on your screen sometimes. They show up completely out of focus. You can just see the big globs. It's basically just the low frequency information. And then with time, you start to see more details and more and more and more details. You see this in Google Earth or Google Maps a lot. That's a kind of processing that I don't think has really yet been taken advantage of, because it means that you can often get the answer immediately. Get enough of an answer to know this is not the direction you want to go, for example. So you get some partial results, and you should be able to use that. And we talked about that a lot. We wrote about it. That's a part of our work that has not been picked up on. So the schema papers, which I guess there were 3 or 4 of them, and they probably were more important to the psychology community than to the AI community, because I really don't think there was much new to the AI community. Was it? Who knows? It's too late. It's now 30, 40 years later. We can't remember what was new and what was not. But they really had surprising impact, and I'm going to come back to the impact. The second kind of work we did was on processing itself, and we had a paper called Data and Resource Limited Processing, which, once again, to us, was just very obvious. And we started talking about how obvious this was and how it helped explain a whole bunch of psychological results that psychologists were too dumb to notice. And so we wrote a paper, and indeed it's our most popular paper. In fact, if you go to the ISI Science Citation Index and look up Danny Bobrow, it's his most popular paper. And if you go and look up me, it's my most popular paper. Now, the Science Citation Index only includes a limited number of journals. Well, they claim it includes all journals. But it's only peer-refereed journals. Does not include most conference proceedings, does not include books. And so actually in the fields we're talking about here, a lot of the publications are either books or conference proceedings. So ISI doesn't do AI the best. But nonetheless, it's still impressive, I thought, that this paper is still the most important paper, according to ISI, for both Danny and for me. What we were talking about was simply that, it takes effort to do something, and the processor only has so much effort it can put out, and when it reaches its limit, it can't do any better. And so in the beginning, when the processor has lots and lots of extra cycles left, its ability to do something is limited by the quality of the data given it. Because it has lots of processing to put on it, it just can't do any better than the data you feed it. So it's data limited. But when, in fact, the problem requires a huge amount of processing cycles, more than it has, its ability to do something is limited by its resources. So it's resource limited. It's that simple. And when you start looking, though, at psychological processing, how we manage to do 2 things at once, 5 things at once, 20 things at once, it turns out to be a very powerful way of looking at psychological attention and a lot of aspects of psychological behavior. So it's a really simple-minded concept, but remarkably powerful. And we also invented something called performance operating characteristics, where if you had doing 2 tasks at the same time, you could look at the trade-off. There's a certain number of resources, so what's the performance of one task versus the performance of the other? As you increase performance on one, once you get into the resource-limited section of operation, you must therefore decrease performance on the other. In retrospect, it sounds pretty obvious, but seemed to have been important. The third is a paper we call descriptions, which I think is our least understood paper, although it's Danny's third most cited paper, and his first most is the paper on resource limited and data limited processes. The second most cited paper, according to ISI, is a paper with Stefik on, where is he? The, what was the black, not the whiteboard paper. The chalkboard paper.
No idea.
You have no idea, did you? Yeah, no, the chalkboard paper is, let's see if I can find it. That's ISI. But yeah, the chalkboard paper is actually Stefik, Foster, Bobrow, Kahn, and somebody else. Beyond the chalkboard. And the third most important paper was the descriptions paper. The descriptions paper is this. How do you remember something? I mean, in some sense, think about it this way. Your conscious you, the ego, conscious part of the head, decides it needs to remember something, so it issues a command down to the memory structure and says, bring it back. But it doesn't know what it's trying to remember, because if it knew, it wouldn't have to remember it. I mean, it would know it, right? So if it doesn't know what it's trying to remember, how does it say, what was this? It describes it. That was the whole notion. It describes it. And in the description, well, it's often ambiguous, and so you end up with the wrong results. And there's the same kinds of descriptions apply in doing actions. I want to throw something into a container, and I sort of describe where I'm going to do, and I need some sort of opening, right? So I throw towards the opening. And it's the same as this continuously available notion I was talking about before. If I don't want to do much processing, I give a really rough description. If I have some time, I can give a precise description. But if I give a rough description, I'm apt to do the wrong thing. I'm apt to find lots of things that fit the description. And so errors in descriptions account for a huge number of kinds of action errors that we make. When we intend to do one thing and we do something different. True story, person going out running, comes home, sweaty t-shirt, takes off the t-shirt, intends to throw it into the hamper, but throws it into the toilet. And I argue that's because the toilet is a kind of container, and the hamper is a kind of container, and they therefore fit similar descriptions. And so we talked a lot about descriptions in memory retrieval, descriptions in action, and I think it's a very important concept, and I'm not sure it has been well understood. In fact, I always thought it was ill understood and ill appreciated, and was very surprised when I started doing some data collection to discover it was, gee, Danny's third most popular paper, and in my list of popularity, I forget what number, but it's very high up there. So those are the three major papers. The fourth paper was Gus, which was really interesting. Gus was an attempt to do natural language understanding in an airline reservation system. And it was a big group of people. There was Ron Kaplan and Terry Winograd and Danny. Those are the main people I remember. And what was interesting is I was knowledgeable at linguistics. Among other weird things in my history is I took the very first course offered by this young professor, assistant professor, hired at MIT, whose name was Noam Chomsky. So I actually had been there from the beginning too. So the slide that said the 30-year path towards production of productization of natural languages isn't 30 years. It's 60 years. And it isn't there yet either, for that matter. Overnight successes take a long time. Well, Gus was this very interesting system, and it was schema-based and very sophisticated language processing. And it had a very good task, and we now know that actually if you specify the task, that gives you most of the power of being able to do much of language processing. So you were going to make airline reservations. And what my job was to sort of put some psychological realism into it. So I would go down periodically back to La Jolla and get my graduate students to do some observations on how people really made airline reservations. And at one point, I now think we invented a procedure that's today called the Wizard of Oz procedure. And we simply call it a computer simulation. That is, we simulated a computer. And so what we did is we had the system Gus running in my lab at La Jolla, which consisted of a person sitting at a computer terminal typing in, I want to fly to Palo Alto, and a person in the other room reading it, quickly, madly looking up things in a book, and then typing back a response as if he were the computer. Computer simulation. So I remember one of the last results of my fondest of the Gus project is when we decided to test the way that Gus worked and to see if it was effective at making reservations. Well, we had people sitting down, and almost all the trips are between San Diego and San Francisco. And so you'd say, I want to go to San Diego, and you'd sit down. The computer would say, I'm Gus, can I help you? Would you like to make a reservation? You'd say, yes, I'd like to go to San Diego. And it would say, when do you want to leave? The traditional response to when the computer says, when do you want to leave? The answer is always something like, oh, I've got a 3 p.m. meeting, and I have to get a rental car, and I want to stop and pick up something along the way. Gus couldn't handle that one. But that's a typical way you actually tell your travel agent, who does factor in roughly how much time is going to be required, and then therefore reasons backwards from when you have to get there to when you must leave. Nonetheless, Gus was quite good. But my favorite response is, you finally would say, boom, 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 and Gus would say, okay, I have a flight for you at 6:05 p.m. on Wednesday, blum, 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 blum. And the person would look at it and say, 6:05 p.m., can you find one a little bit earlier? And Gus would say, yes, I have a flight at 6 p.m. Now, is that a success to the natural language understander or not? It is a legitimate response to the question. And it means, though, that natural language understanding is to take into account a lot more than the literal translation of the words. And that actually remains my favorite result of Gus. And I believe it's even in the paper. And it was a really nice paper, by the way, because it was one of these papers, we were all rather proud of the fact that we revealed all of the flaws of the system as well as the strengths. And that, I think, makes it relatively unique in the publications where most people hide their flaws. And I think it's also made it more important. So I don't even know if Gus ever was followed up by anybody else. But it was a really neat publication. Now let me come to my last part of my talk, which is, how does someone who hates to write get so many publications? So I looked up Danny in the citation indexes. I tried CiteSeer, which I couldn't make any sense of, mainly because CiteSeer is not made to do rankings of people and citations and so on. It's made to look up papers. So there are two others. The ISI Web of Science, which I've already said, is the standard one that academics use, but it's really restricted to peer-reviewed journals, so isn't always appropriate. But according to ISI, 4 of our joint papers are in the list of Danny's 10 most cited publications, and 1 is his most highly cited publication. And it's also my most highly cited publication, so that I thought was pretty interesting. And mind you, both of us are widely published and widely cited, so that's non-trivial. There's another citing, which is a Google Scholar, and I found this wonderful program called Publish or Perish that Ken Forbus has been telling me about it. He found it too, which it's a downloadable program, and it does all the work for you. You put it in somebody's name or group of people's names. It goes to Google Scholar and collects all the statistics and aggregates them and then gives you a list of all the statistics and all of the papers rank ordered by citations. So it's actually quite powerful. Using that, you get a different picture because it includes lots and lots of things. So Danny's most cited paper, as I said, is the Beyond Chalkboard. The Norman and Bobrow paper drops out at number 2. But there's another interesting thing. From Google Scholar, every one of his top 10 papers is a jointly authored paper. And just for comparison, I used me to compare my publication record with his. Out of my top 10, only 3 are jointly authored. Jointly authored. According to Google Scholar, Danny has 259 papers. Now, that's more than Danny claims to have, and that has to do with the way that Google Scholar counts them. First of all, several papers, a lot of papers are multiply counted. Comes out as a PARC publication first, and then gets into a journal. Sometimes it's then picked up in an edited book. And sometimes there are also different spellings of the author's names, which they confuse and get them as separate. But even so, 259 papers, 6,000 citations, but most interesting, the number of authors per paper, the average number of authors per paper is basically 3. I looked myself up. It claims I have 340 papers, which I don't. But still, the average number of authors of my papers is half of Danny's, 1.4. So that's a beginning. Did Danny ever write a paper by himself, I wondered? Not that I can tell. Well, he has a PhD thesis, that's true. And he has an editorial or 2. And he has lots of books which claim to be just Bobrow, but when you look at them, they're edited books, so he put it all together. And he's written introductions and editorials and a bunch of small things, but has he written scientific papers by himself? Well, I recall one of his papers, Dimensions of Representations, written just by Danny. It was published in a volume edited by Bobrow and Collins. Now, if there's anyone who writes less than Danny, it's Alan Collins, who hates to write. So it must have been a fun book to put together. I can't imagine how it ever happened. So how about Danny's paper? There he is, all by himself. You would give an answer? I'd like to hear it too.
About what?
Well, I just told the answer.
It was 1974. It was dedicated to Jaime Carbonell, who died suddenly.
It was 1974, dedicated to Jaime Carbonell, who was at BBN, who died, who was doing wonderful work in education and died early death.
So Jaime Carbonell, you might know, is his son.
And actually, it was the same year that I was working on a similar book, and we both fought to get our books out first because each book used the word cognitive science. We wanted to be the first to get the word cognitive science into the field, and Danny won. But so how come he has this chapter all by himself? Well, I happen to know that answer. I typed it. Now, it's Danny's chapter. But what happened is he kept complaining to me for months and months and months about, oh, he had this paper chapter he wanted to write, but he just couldn't write it. And I finally got tired of it. So I dragged him into his own office, and I sat down at his computer, and I said, tell me what this chapter is about. And he would say, well, and he'd give me the first line, and I would type it. And then he would give me the second line, and I would type it. And so over time, I typed the whole paper, edited while I was listening to it, and then gave it to him, and he said, oh, thank you, and that was the chapter. So that's how Danny writes papers, as far as I can tell. He's really good at getting other people to work with him. People to do the work, and not only does he get the credit, but you feel good about it afterwards. And you should feel good, because actually you learn a tremendous amount by doing this. I learned a lot about dimensions of representation in working with Danny and getting his paper out. And we learned a lot just wandering the streets and the hills and the cliffs of Del Mar and La Jolla and Menlo Park and wherever. Because as Terry Winograd pointed out, there's just a wonderful breadth of knowledge, and you never know what's going to come out. And if you just keep an open mind, boom. What was that store there, Danny? And then Danny would go into some long story, and soon we had another paper. So it's been really neat. And it hasn't ended yet. It has not stopped yet. We're still at it. So who knows whether we'll have an 8th paper, 7th paper, 9th paper. We might. We might. Thank you.
Any questions, or Danny, you want to rebut?
But you might actually find going through these databases fun. It's like you find surprises, like you didn't know that your paper was that popular. And by the way, it's very popular at all of the data citation indexes. It's the top one in the Google Scholar Base puts the Stefik, et cetera, paper as number 1. And the descriptions paper is number 2. Or you never knew. Never knew you were that popular.
Okay, thank you.